Fletcher Tabato.
Chair, thank you for the opportunity to speak, and I just acknowledge the Minister for now taking 2 calls in this debate. It highlights for me, I was raised well, I like to think, in that you acknowledge your elders and their experience, and there are very few in the House who have more experience and more knowledge about New Zealand and its economy than the Minister. So I fully acknowledge that. But so it was particularly frustrating to sit here and be told that we'd gained a surplus. This wafer-thin surplus based on the grounding down of government departments, the conglomeration, the super ministry brought together to create efficiencies within government's day-to-day operations so that they can cut and cut and cut costs. And more than that, Mr Chair, they have ground down the very daily lives of the average New Zealander. I talk about health, I talk about homes, even infrastructure in Northland. I think to promise 10 bridges, in terms of infrastructure and growing the Northland economy was a wonderful thing to say. It was wonderful to say it. But where's the follow-through, Mr Chairman? Where's the follow-through? It's not there. No. It's an artificial surplus. Cuts here, cuts there. Yeah. So much so that this example for me just highlights the ludicrous nature of this situation. A dock ship, sir, a Department of Conservation vehicle, took the big oil industry players out into our oceans, our deep sea oceans, so that they could further explore deep sea oil drilling in New Zealand. That was DOC. The Department of Conservation was facilitating the exploration of these big oil companies to go out and explore oil exploitation in off New Zealand shores. And the mandate was, you guys need to make more money. Create your own revenue. It's not good enough to ask the New Zealand taxpayer to do it. Well, the government won't do it. And so here we are today talking about artificial surpluses. So let's accept that the Minister's words are true and that there was a surplus. So the reality is, Mr Chairman, is that surplus is a short-term, short-minded focus on balancing books today. The question that party needs to be asking over there, those members of that side of the House need to be asking, is what is the true long-term cost to New Zealanders of trying desperately to gain this surplus? What will that do to those who are raised in substandard housing? What will that do to those who are suffering so poorly in terms of their health and not able to find real alternatives in our public health system so that they can come back and contribute to the economy? What will it do to the low-income earner now who resorts to a crime, goes out there because they literally can't feed their family, and they resort to desperate measures, which we would call unacceptable, but when you reflect, it's just unacceptable, sir. So there's no strategy here. There's no long-term strategy, and I think the Chairman of Finance and Expenditure highlights that very point brilliantly. Long-term strategy, no. So Mr Joyce, for example, in terms of a long-term strategy to grow the economy, is travelling around the world trying to find foreign investors to come and buy up New Zealand's assets. Yeah. That's his investment strategy. And so I stand here and I acknowledge that Mr Joyce, in doing so, if he finds those investors, will increase New Zealand's GDP. But that highlights the farcical nature of GDP as a measure of a country's success. Because as those GDP figures go up through investment and business undertaken within our borders, the profits simply go offshore. Incomes will fall because, well, actually, in most of our trade agreements, for example, to China, and within the TPP, for example, there's provisions there to bring in labour from offshore and they don't have to comply with, Mr Chair.
Fletcher Tabatau.
Thank you very much, Mr Chairman. They don't have to comply with local employment legislation. So we're talking about cheap labour brought in offshore to facilitate the profits of foreign companies, which then they take offshore. It just makes no sense. GDP will increase. That's a given. It's accepted. But what will that do for everyday New Zealanders? Nothing. Nothing. In fact, it will make us worse off. The inequality problem that New Zealand has been facing for decades now will continue to grow, and this government has done nothing to address that, sir. I just wanted to address some comments from the chairman of FNE and some of the other members in the House from the other side. It wasn't Mr Bennett himself, but some of the members have used pretty words, have used wonderful rhetoric to describe a New Zealand economy that's doing well, it's strong, it's fantastic. That's the rhetoric, that's the picture that's being painted from that side of the House. It's wonderful. But the reality is, when the crunch came, when we came to the point and the crunch came in the by-election last year, for example, it highlighted, sir, the fact that our regions, for example, are being completely neglected by this government. For Joyce, Mr Joyce, to go around the country and come up with these regional development plans with no money behind them, and then for them to be abused of any common sense or any benefit from the people within those communities, just highlights the dearth of actual strategy that this government has to grow our regions. So they want to grow Auckland. Auckland, big city. Let's get up with the modern world. Well, the reality there is incomes in Auckland have fallen since average incomes in Auckland have fallen since this government this party on that side of the House came into government. That is a reality. So it's just unacceptable. Mr Bennett said to the House in his contribution earlier that we're enjoying the lowest interest rates that this country has ever seen. I think he doesn't realise that that underpins the farcical nature of the comment. First of all, there's 2 points to make around that. They are not low by international standards. They are ridiculously high. And that is creating huge pressures for our foreign currency exchange. Our dollar is so overvalued, it's not funny, and it's undermining the very industry, and I mean export industry, that this government purports to want to support. They're undermining every effort that private businesses are trying to take to export overseas by failing to manage our official cash rate and our foreign exchange. So it's ridiculous. And the second point, Mr Chair, is it's simply an indication of how badly the economy is struggling. Low interest rates are indicative of a time of low growth, constraints, and so the guys who are yelling abuse at me need to listen to what I'm saying. They're high by international standards. So what we're seeing is this ridiculous juxtaposition of, by contrast, they are too high by international standards, but here in New Zealand, they're not doing enough for local businesses and they need to come down. It's just absurd, sir. Immigration. New Zealand first. These guys label us as xenophobics for wanting controlled immigration policy. Simply manage the flow of people coming into New Zealand so that we actually get skilled labour where we need it. This uncontrolled inflow that we're seeing now is a band-aid on the New Zealand economy. And it's a band-aid, Mr Chairman, because it simply covers up the reality that GDP per person, the income of a New Zealander here, the individual New Zealander, is going down and it is not going up. That is the band-aid that immigration is for this country. And the fact that it's pretty much 2/3 of it going straight into Auckland so that the infrastructure there cannot cope is just absurd. So earlier today in the House, Mr English was asked about what conditions.
Brett Hudson.
Thank you, Mr Chair.